In this video, we will show you how to replace your cam position sensor on this Acura MDX with a 3.7-liter engine. This will be located behind your timing belt. Let's get into it. Let's remove our upper engine cover. To do that, use a flathead screwdriver. You're going to find two flathead plastic screws along the front that you just want to turn a quarter turn counterclockwise until they're dislodged. Then you can carefully start lifting it up. Along the backside, it does have two small locating tabs that are supposed to press into rubber grommets. Just go ahead and give that a quick inspection and set it aside. Let's move from there over to our power steering reservoir. We're just going to dislodge this from its mounting bracket. That can fairly easily be done by this one locking tab. You can use a small screwdriver if necessary, otherwise just use your finger and carefully pull this out of place. Now that we have some movement here, we can gain focus on our serpentine belt, which is along the passenger side of the engine here. Before you start removing it, pay close attention to the belt routing. You're going to find it goes over some pulleys and around and under others. Once you have note of that, continue on to the removal of the belt. To remove your serpentine belt, we're going to come just underneath our power steering pump pulley here. You're going to be able to find the tensioner pulley. In the center of the pulley, there's a mounting bolt. We're going to be taking hold of this, turning it counterclockwise. This will release tension from the belt, and we can remove the belt from any one of the pulleys that's easiest. Be using a 14 millimeter for this. While holding pressure here, we can take hold of that serpentine belt. We'll gently start pulling it away from the power steering pump pulley. Be careful not to cause any damage to the belt. We can remove our tool and the serpentine belt from the area. Once you have the serpentine belt out of position, give it a thorough inspection. If it has to be replaced, go ahead and replace it. You can see it coming off of the crank down there. When inspecting the belt, you want to pay attention to both sides. You'll have the smooth area, make sure it's not dry rotted and cracked. Other than that, you also have the area with the grooves. As for those, you want to ensure you do not have any cracks making their way across here, and the grooves aren't so deep that the belt is actually getting thin. This one still looks as though it's in fair condition. We'll set this aside for reuse. Now we need to set up the engine on top dead center. To do that, we're going to gain focus on the forward cam cover here. This also covers your timing belt. On the side of the timing cover, you're going to find you have a small rubber plug. I'm just going to use a small screwdriver for this. We'll pop it out of place. Now inside this area, you're going to find your cam gear. And if you were to be able to turn the crank, what you would find along this area would be several numbers that make their way around. To get the engine on top dead center, we need to have the marking located in this port on the number 1. And down at the crank, we also need to have the timing marked there as well. So with that said, let's safely raise and support and remove our right front wheel. Once you safely raised and supported the front of the vehicle, go ahead and remove the wheel by removing all 5 of your 22 millimeter lug nuts. With the wheel out of the way, we have a clear view of our crank pulley. This is where we're going to be focusing. If you feel as though you need a little bit more room in this area to continue working, you can dislodge the inside fender liner. You don't have to fully remove it, but we will dislodge the front and we'll tuck this aside. To do that, we're going to make our way underneath the front bumper cover. You're going to find that you have 2 push clips here that we do want to remove so we can dislodge the front of the fender liner. To remove push clips, typically you just want to carefully start removing the center to unlock it. Once it's unlocked, remove the outer portion as well. We'll make our way all the way across here, heading towards that wheel well. We have another push clip, same process. Continuing up from there, we've got a push clip here. This one's a little bit different. We'll replace that one. We'll continue upward a little bit more. This is about as far as we have to go push clip wise, but as you make your way down along the fender, you may find that you have a Phillips head screw holding it in place here. Go ahead and remove that as well. Let's take hold of that fender liner. A little wiggle. We'll start sliding it aside and tucking it out of our way. Now that we have the shield out of the way, we have a clear view of our crank pulley and our 19mm bolt that's holding the crank pulley to the engine itself. It's common for this to be hard to remove. If that's the case, you can use a crank holder tool, which essentially looks like this right here. It's going to fit directly inside this area. While holding clockwise pressure on this, you can use a 19mm socket right in the center and attempt to turn that counterclockwise while holding the engine from trying to spin on you. If you're using an air gun, generally these will come out fairly easily. Got our 19mm. I'm just going to fully remove this bolt so I can give it a quick inspection and then reinstall it hand tight. We're going to have to use this bolt to turn the engine over clockwise, aligning our timing marks. Before we do that, I want to show you where the timing marks are on the crank pulley and on the timing cover. Now let's start looking at the harmonic balancer or crank pulley for our timing marks. Our pulley's already been marked with a white marker, but essentially for you, what you need to pay attention to is the inboard groove here. What you'd want to do is just use a flat blade screwdriver and run it along the very inner edge. Typically, you're going to find that you have several grooves. The mark we're looking for, if you have the markings down along the bottom of the pulley like I do here, would be the marker that's all the way towards the front of the vehicle. Essentially, if this was turning clockwise, it'll be the last marker that makes its way up to our timing mark that I'm going to show you in a second on the timing cover. Now, as we make our way up along the back side of the crank pulley here, you can see our timing belt cover, and there's a small triangle. We need to make sure we have that mark that we just talked about on the harmonic balancer aligned with the very tip of this triangle. Once you have that aligned, you need to take a peek inside that upper port on the forward cover up along the top of the engine there, and we're looking for the number 1. If you do not see the number 1, you need to continue turning the crank one full rotation until this marking is realigned down here, and then check up there again. At that point, you should be on top dead center, cylinder 1. Let's make our way back up into the engine compartment, and we're going to be looking in the port that goes into the timing belt cover. I have a mirror down in this area. It makes things a little bit easier to see. If I was looking through this port on my application right now, it looks as though I can see a number 4 there. We'll continue on turning the crank pulley bolt with our 19mm socket clockwise until we can see a number 1 in this port, and we also have our marking aligned with the triangle on that lower cover. Okay, so right here, I have my lower markings aligned. But up along the top, I can tell that I'm definitely not on the number 1, which tells me that I'm not on top dead center. Here's where you have to turn the crank a complete 360 degrees, one full turn, all the way back to this mark, have a quick peek inside that upper cover, and confirm you're on number 1. Okay, we're getting close here. I'm going to slow down. This isn't a race. Should be getting pretty close. All right, so at this point, I can see the number 1 inside the port, but if I'm looking at the lower markings, I'm not properly aligned yet. So we'll just continue on turning this until it is. Right about there. At this point, we're on top dead center, and we can continue on. Along the passenger side front of the engine bay, we're going to start removing the coolant reservoir from the area. We'll start at the top. Go ahead and unscrew that cap by turning it counterclockwise. Keep in mind there could still be coolant inside this coolant hose. You don't want to make a mess with that or get it on your skin or eyes. We'll set that aside along towards the front of the vehicle here, making sure that it does not spill out any coolant. Now, if you were to follow that coolant tank down, you're going to find an area where your power steering hose goes into the side of the coolant reservoir. Go ahead and pull that right out of place. Follow the coolant reservoir back up to the top. Now we have a push clip. To remove your push clip, go ahead and start removing the center to unlock it, and then remove the outer portion. Continuing from here, we can take hold of the coolant reservoir, and we're going to lift it up and out of position. You may have to maneuver the power steering reservoir out of the way and squeeze this past the AC lines. As we make our way down along the side of the engine, we're going to have to remove two mounting bolts. You can see the upper tensioner pulley here. We're going to move just below it to the next smooth pulley. Remove the center bolt using a 14 millimeter. There we are. Now that I have that loose, we're going to have to make our way back into the wheel well. There's a second mounting bolt that's located just underneath this area. It's a lot easier to get to from down there. Now in the wheel well, we can see the pulley that we just dislodged from the tensioner. If you were to move just below that, you're going to find a 12 millimeter bolt holding the tensioner to the engine. Once we have that removed, we can remove this entire thing. We're going to have to remove our upper side engine mount. Before you do that, you need to apply light pressure underneath your engine oil pan. If you're using a jack, make sure you have a small piece of wood in between the oil pan and the jack. Once you do have pressure there, we'll make our way back up into the engine compartment. If you were looking just underneath your power steering pump pulley, you're going to find your upper mount. Before we start removing the mount, let's remove this bracket which holds our ground wire in place. To remove that, it has a 10 millimeter bolt. Go ahead and remove the bolt, a quick inspection, and remove the bracket from this upper mount. Now we're going to start removing this upper mount from its mounting point here. It's held in place with a couple 14 millimeter bolts along the top. With both of those out of place, we'll continue on along the front area here. For this bolt, we'll be using a 17 millimeter to remove this. Just a quick inspection of that as we continue moving on. At this point, you should be able to take hold of this mount. You do not need to fully remove it from the vehicle, but we are just going to tip it up and out of our way. It's time to start removing our upper timing belt covers. The process for one's going to be pretty much the same as the other. The rearward one's a little bit harder to gain access to. We'll start with the front. As for this timing belt cover, you're going to find that you have 5 10 millimeter headed bolts holding it in place. There's one here. There's one just above that one. You're going to find one inside of this port right here. As we continue towards the front, you have one right up in the open. And the other one's going to be down right in this area here. It's a little bit more difficult to see, but essentially if you were just to feel underneath the cover, you're going to find the bolt head. Now that I have that one out of there, since this one's pretty much the easiest one to gain access to, I'm going to save it for last. Let's make our way down to that lower bolt that's a little bit difficult to see underneath the cover. We've got the one in the center of the cover here, right in that small port. Now it's time for the last mounting bolt for the forward cover. Take hold of the timing belt cover and remove it from the vehicle. Just a quick inspection of that, make sure it's not broken or damaged in any way. This looks fine. Set it aside. With the cover out of the way, let's just have one more look in this area. Looking along where we have our number 1 and our marking on the cam gear, you want to make sure that you have that matched up with the housing right on the engine here. I've marked both areas in pink, so it's a little bit easier to see. Looking at the rear upper timing belt cover, you can see that there's a small wiring harness that fits inside a groove that runs along the top there. Just go ahead and dislodge the wiring harness from this area and we can continue on with our 5 10mm bolts. As for the 5 bolts, you can see one up along the top area here. There's going to be one along this side. As you make your way down, there should be 3 making their way across here. We'll continue downward from there. I can see the next 10mm mounting bolt. There's that one. Let's move along to the center bolt that's in this circular port. Some of these bolts might be easier to gain access through the wheel well. That's really up to you. There's that one. Now let's move to our 4th mounting bolt. I can see it kind of behind the power steering pump pulley. There we are. I got it broken free. See if I can turn that out by hand. Now we can make our way to that upper quarter mounting bolt here, the one that's the easiest to get to. Once you have that out of the way, go ahead and remove your timing belt cover. Start removing this cover. Just a quick inspection of that. If it looks like the seal's coming out of place, just go ahead and press it back in. Set it aside. With the cover out of the way, we're going to have a look at the cam gear here. We have the area with our marking that's directly on it. I've marked it in pink. Then we also have the area on the engine. You can see that line. I've also marked that as well. Now that we've finished doing that, we're going to have to remove the power steering pump pulley from the power steering pump so we can make our way under it to gain access to a 10mm headed mounting bolt. To prevent the pulley from wanting to spin while you try to loosen the nut, we're going to carefully use a small prying device or even a flathead screwdriver if necessary and bring it right on through the groove that's in the power steering pump pulley and rest it up against the casing here. Once you have that in place and you cannot turn this counterclockwise, we can start removing our 19mm mounting nut. Continuing from there, take hold of the power steering pump pulley, give it a little wiggle, and separate it from the power steering pump. If you need to tap on it, just be careful not to cause any damage. With that out of the way, we have a clear view of the 10mm headed bolt that's located just down here, holding this plastic piece to this upper engine mount. Once you make your way down here, remove your crank pulley bolt and the crank pulley. Using our 19mm again. When removing this, typically you can just rock it side to side to slide it off. It shouldn't really be stuck on there very hard, but if you do have to pry it, just be extremely careful not to cause any damage. Now looking at this, you can see that it has a notch for a keyway. Looking at our crank, you can see our square key. It's important to take note of that. Let's start removing the lower cover. This is held in place with 7 10mm headed mounting bolts. There's 2 along the bottom, 2 in the center here, 1 in the very center, and then 1 along each side. Start down along the bottom. The one that's all the way across from there is actually tucked in behind this area. It's not very hard to get to, just a little bit difficult to see. Now it's time for the last mounting bolt, and we can pull this lower shield out of place. Let's remove the shield. We'll just give this a quick inspection and set it aside. Now we can start removing this lower bracket leading to the engine. The bracket itself is held in place to the engine with 3 14mm headed bolts. You can see one in the open right here. The other 2 are located above it. I'm going to start with the hardest one to get to, which is located right inside this port right up here. There's very little clearance. Essentially, once you break it free, continue on unscrewing it by hand, being very careful not to pinch yourself. The bolt will not fully pull out of here until we remove the mount from the vehicle. Let's move to the one that's just to the rear of that one. Let's get this last one out of here. Keep in mind, as you remove this final bolt, it's the last thing holding this bracket in place. Do not let it fall down and potentially hurt you. Slide this out of place with the mounting bolt still intact. Just give that a quick inspection. Continuing from there, I'm just going to take each one of the bolts that I had removed and slide them right on back through that bracket. Now we know exactly where each one of them goes. We'll set this aside. Down along the bottom where the crankshaft is, we have to remove this washer. Before you do so, it's a good idea to go ahead and mark the outboard side of it, because once you have it off and you go to reinstall it, you want to make sure you have it in the same orientation. I don't know if you can tell, but it's actually beveled along the edge, and you want to have that bevel facing out. After you've removed that, we're going to remove this bracket by removing our 2 10mm headed mounting nuts, holding it in place. Remove your bracket, a quick inspection, and we'll set it aside. Before you start removing your timing belt, it's important to make sure you mark several areas. We'll be starting down along where the crank pulley is. When we mark it, we're looking for any of the teeth on the crank pulley in comparison to the grooves that are on the belt. To mark this, I'm going to take my paint marker. You can use pretty much anything that'll mark this and will not come off. It's important that it does not come off, otherwise you may find that you have an issue. I'm going to mark one of my grooves here, and then 2 of my teeth on the belt. Now that we have it marked down here, we're going to make our way up to the 2 cam gears and repeat this process. Now that I've marked that, I'm just going to put a C here for crank, so we know exactly where this marking was. Now as we make our way to the cam up here, I'm going to mark this with white. You can use any color. I just like to switch it up. I'm going to mark right on where that cylinder 1 marking was that we already talked about before. We have that aligned in the proper area. Continuing from there, I'm going to mark inside of each one of these grooves on the timing belt itself, so I know that those are the ones that go right around this area. Make sure you've got plenty on there. We do not want this to rub off while we're taking off the belt, otherwise you're not going to know exactly where it needs to go. Now, since this is on the front cam, I'm just going to put an F right along the outside of the belt so I can remember exactly where this goes. Now let's move to the rear cam. For this one, we're going to mark right along that groove you can see at the top, and then I'm going to make a line across the upper portion of the belt as well. Get right in this groove. Just try to get that as close as possible. Now that we've finished marking the belt and we have everything out of the way, let's confirm that the crankshaft is properly aligned. It's kind of hard to see, but right on this small tooth here, It actually has a small notch out of it. That notch should line up with this small hatch right up along the top here on the engine. As you can tell, I just need to go a tiny bit clockwise. It's always a good idea to be as close as possible for this. To get this to turn, I'm just going to carefully reinstall my 19mm crank bolt, and we'll turn this clockwise as needed. Right about there. Should be facing pretty much straight up. At this point, we can remove that bolt. We have to focus on the tensioner here. Typically, to release tension on your timing belt, if you were to look along what would be the backside of the engine here, you're going to find a small threaded port. In this area, you could use a 6x1.0 bolt, thread it through all the way till it presses on the tensioner. As it starts pressing on the tensioner, it's going to start pivoting this down, pressing this area in, and you should be able to go ahead and start removing your timing belt. Also, when you do have that pushed all the way in, there's a small pinhole right here, and you can actually see it right on that small shaft right there. Once you did have that pushed through, you could use a small pin or even a drill bit if necessary, slide it through there, and that'll hold the pressure from that tensioner. Our threaded port is damaged, so for me, I'm going to have to do something a little bit different. As a last case scenario, to be able to remove the timing belt from this area, if you can't use that bolt like you should because the threaded port is stripped like ours was, we're going to have to carefully start removing this area. To be able to get this out of here, first we're going to disconnect our oil pressure switch and then remove the oil pressure switch from the housing here. To disconnect the connector, go ahead and squeeze on the locking tab. Once it's disconnected, a quick inspection for corrosion, set it aside. Now we'll be using a 24mm. We'll turn this counterclockwise to start removing it. Keep in mind there could be oil in this area. Be extremely careful and have a collection receptacle handy just in case. Just give that a quick inspection, set it aside. At this point, I'm going to have to carefully start removing each of my two 10mm bolts. But since I don't have anything in here, releasing pressure from the belt, we need to be extremely careful we do not cause any damage when removing these because there is pressure and it's going to want to tilt this entire thing. Just loosen that one, we'll loosen up the second one as well. There we are. Now we can get this out of here. Like I said, typically you do not do it this way. We had an issue where ours was stripped out. Now we can start removing the timing belt. Just make sure you do not spin your cam gears up along the top or your crank down along the bottom. Slide this out of position. Just tucks it in behind there. There's our belt. To prevent anything from making its way inside of the oil filter housing, reinstall your oil pressure switch. You don't need to tighten it up, just make sure it's bottomed out so no miscellaneous debris falls inside this area as you continue. Now let's move up inside the engine compartment so we can pay attention to our forward cam. You can see this gear right here. We have to remove the cam from the engine. To do that, you're going to find you have a 17mm bolt that goes right through the center holding it in place, but before you remove that, you need to ensure that this cannot spin on you. To help prevent this from spinning, use a 12mm socket directly inside of this port here, and what you're looking for is a 12mm headed bolt head right inside there. Should line up pretty much perfectly, slide it right on there. Continuing from here, we'll be using our 17mm to go ahead and break free that center mounting bolt. It's important to make sure that this cam does not spin on you while you continue this process, otherwise the timing of the vehicle could be off. Just holding the socket on the bolt. Just a quick inspection of the mounting bolt there. Of course, if it does look like it has to be replaced, you definitely want to do that. This looks fine. Now that we have the bolt off, we want to have a look right inside the center of the cam area here. You can see that it does have a keyway. That's important to note. That'll help you align this properly for the reinstallation process. Continuing from here, take hold of the cam, give it a little wiggle, and slide it out of position. Continuing on from here, we're going to remove this plate, which is held in place with two 12mm headed bolts. You can see one here, and one's located just diagonally forward, down along the bottom of that shaft there. I'll loosen the first one, leave it in a couple threads, fully remove the next one, and then we can get this whole plate out of here. As you start pulling this out of place, there's going to be a wiring harness up and behind where the power steering pump is. So once we start pulling this away, we need to make sure that we do disconnect it. You can see the portion of the cam position sensor here, but it does make its way through the backside of the plate, protruding out right there. If you're going to pry this out of place, just be extremely careful not to cause any damage. It really shouldn't take very much pressure at all. With that pulled away, I can see the cam position sensor. We have our electrical harness. We have to disconnect it. It has a small squeezable tab that you can press in. If you have a hard time squeezing it, use a small angled pick. We'll carefully get underneath this area and pry up against that locking tab. Should be able to pull this out of place. There, looks like it broke free. A quick inspection on that connector right there. Make sure there's no corrosion. We can slide this up and out of here. To remove the cam position sensor from this plate, we'll remove our one 8mm headed bolt holding it in place. Now that we've got the bolt out of there, we can take hold of the cam position sensor, give it a little wiggle, and lift it up and out of position. There it is, friend. Before we install our brand new cam position sensor, let's clean and inspect the mounting plate. If you need to, use a piece of fine sandpaper and give the area a light scuffing. We don't want to cause any damage, we just want to make sure there isn't any miscellaneous corrosion or debris. We're paying extra special attention to where that cam position sensor will go. Inside this area, it's common to have a light amount of corrosion, so we just want to ensure that we get all that out of there. Once again, we're not trying to remove any material, just the corrosion. After completing that, it's time to install our brand new camshaft position sensor. We'll carefully take this, slide it through. There really shouldn't be any resistance. Once you have that in the proper positioning, we'll continue on with our 8mm headed mounting bolt. Just go ahead and start that in, snug it up. The torque for this is very light. It's only 36 inch-pounds. Now right in the center here, you can see the camshaft, and right around it, you have the cam seal. We want to make sure you do not see any oil coming out of there. If you do see oil, you need to replace the seal, and now's the time to do it. We'll just go ahead and give this a quick wipe, a close inspection, and then we can continue on with our installation. Let's get this down in here. Once you have it close to being in place, we're going to go with that electrical connector. Press it in, listen for a click. You need to make sure that this is properly secured. You don't want to have a loose connection here. That will be an issue. Could hear a click from that. I'm just going to give it a little tug. Obviously, we want to make sure it is secured. Now we can start getting this in place. We'll start in each of our two 12mm headed mounting bolts, snug them up. The torque for these is 16 foot-pounds. Let's get our cam on here. You can see we have our keyway, and on the camshaft we have our notched out area for that to slide onto. Before installing the mounting bolt, make sure you clean the threads and then apply clean motor oil to those threads before installing. We'll start in the mounting bolt by hand, snug it up. The torque for this is 67 foot-pounds. When torquing it, make sure you have your 12mm socket on that bolt, preventing this from spinning on you. There we are. Continue on to removing your oil pressure switch from this area. Careful nothing falls inside, obviously. All right, now we can get ready to install this. You want to make sure you leave this pin in until you already have the belt in and over each one of the pulleys properly. That's going to press right up against this area on the tensioner. For these bolts, you want to start them in, snug them up. Just make sure we don't have any wiring harnesses going behind there. We don't want to cause any damage to anything. The torque for these is 8.7 foot-pounds. We'll just double check the torque on each one of these before we continue on. Once again, do not remove this pin yet. Just give this a quick wipe, confirm there's no debris up in this area. Apply a thin amount of thread sealer to the threads on your oil pressure switch. Start it in by hand, bottom it out, snug it up with your 24mm wrench. Right there is bottomed out. I'm just going to take it a tiny bit further just to confirm everything's properly secured here. Reconnect your electrical connector. For the connector, just press it in, listen for a click, a light tug to make sure it's secured. You can hear a click on that. With all the pulleys in place, the next thing we need to do is check the alignment of each one of our cogs. We have the one that's on the crank here. Essentially, if you were to look over the keyway, right on this tooth here, you can see that there's a small divot. That divot needs to be aligned with the arrow that's on the housing of the engine right here. Once you've confirmed that that's properly situated, let's make our way to the upper cam gears and confirm that each one of those are aligned as well. Now up in this area, you can see the marking on the casing. It's aligned with this tooth, which also has its marking. As you can tell, we're properly aligned. If you needed to, you could carefully take hold of this and gently turn it in one direction or the other as necessary. Repeat the process for the rear cam gear. When installing your timing belt, we'll start down at the crank. Once we have it aligned here, we can install our metal bracket holding the belt in place, and we're going to continue on counterclockwise. I'm just going to take that belt, I'll slide it all the way up to the top there. I've got my C and my blue marking. We're going to make sure we have that properly aligned. Now, as you can tell, this is properly aligned, but have a look at this. If you are off by even one tooth, like you can see here, or in the other direction, the vehicle may not run at all, or if it does run, it might run very poorly. Once you have that bracket on there, it should hold the belt in place, and you don't necessarily have to worry about it falling out. Let's continue on to tightening each one of these mounting nuts, and we'll continue on counterclockwise, making our way up towards the front of the engine, inside the engine compartment. Okay, right there's bottomed out. I'm just going to take it a tiny bit further here. You can see the belt sitting exactly where it needs to be. We're still in our grooves. Take the belt, bring it right over that idler pulley. We'll take the belt, we'll put it up and over the idler pulley here. And we're also going to take the rearward portion of the belt and we'll just rest it over the tensioner pulley. Let's make our way into the engine compartment. Now I'm bringing the belt up and around the front cam cog here. It's common When you bring it up, it doesn't align properly. That's because the belt's supposed to be pretty taut in this area, and it's almost impossible to make it taut enough by hand. So what we're going to do is carefully use a 17 millimeter. I'm going to turn this clockwise just a tiny bit until I get my markings aligned, and then we'll turn it back counterclockwise until it's in the proper positioning. After that, we just need to confirm that each one of these two marks are still aligned, the top and the bottom, and we'll continue on over to the rear cam. Now that we have this properly aligned and we've confirmed down along the bottom that we're also aligned there, let's take the top of this belt, bring it underneath the water pump pulley here in the center, and then all the way up to the top cam. Once again, if you need to repeat the process of carefully turning the cam, you can do so. Now I'm just going to use this tool to hold this in place. That way there I don't have to worry about it coming off. Now for this one, if you find you have a hard time getting it aligned, you could carefully use your 17 millimeter. We'll turn this clockwise a tiny bit, get it in the proper groove, and then reset it at the original timing mark at the top dead center line. That actually went right on there. Okay, bring this around. A little bit. There we are. Now I've got the belt around the rear cam here. I have it properly aligned, making its way all the way around, and I'm holding it there with my specialty tool. Now at this point, we have it going over the tensioner pulley as well. We are still not pulling out that pin yet. Do not pull out the pin. We're making our way over to the idler pulley mounting bolt. We already have our blue thread locker on there. Let's snug this up and then torque it to 33 foot-pounds. As you start tightening this, it's going to apply a little bit of pressure along the forward side of the belt here. Okay. Just going to check that one more time here. Once you feel as though you have it over all the pulleys properly, we're going to reconfirm that we're properly aligned. All the way up here at our cam gears. You can see the forward one pretty much out in the open. That's aligned properly. As we're making our way around, you want to make sure that the belt is taut across your idler pulley, making its way around the cam, confirming it's also taut, making its way around the water pump all the way up to the rearward cam, and we're just going to confirm that that's properly aligned as well. The only place that you should have slack is along the backside, in between the rearward cam, the tensioner, and then all the way down at that crank. Now, if you are using anything to hold the belt in place, go ahead and remove those now. You, of course, don't want to leave those in place. Once you have those off, we're going to continue at the tensioner. It's going to be time to pull that pin. Before you do, you need to confirm that you definitely checked each one of the alignment points and everything is properly taut and aligned as necessary. To pull out the pin on the tensioner, if you find it's under too much tension to be able to pull out, you could carefully use a small prying device in between the pulley and the tensioner itself, applying a tiny bit of pressure here and work that pin right out of position. At this point, it's time to start turning over the engine by hand down at the crank. We're going to reinstall our crank bolt. Once that's in, we can go ahead and start turning this clockwise. And what we'll be paying attention to is each one of our markings as they make their way back around. If you make your way around and it's not properly aligned, you know the belt's not in the proper placement, we'll have to re-release tension, readjust, and then repeat this process. We're going to make several revolutions to confirm everything's aligned properly. We're only turning the engine over clockwise, never counterclockwise. Let's see if we can get this bottom aligned here. Looks pretty close right there. Let's bring this around one more time here. Right about there. Make our way up here. I can see that I'm properly aligned with my forward cam marking. We'll check the rearward cam as well. And now we can see for the rear cam, we're aligned perfectly. Let's go ahead and repeat this process a couple more times. It's important to make sure you're properly aligned before you continue on with the rest of the installation process. We've checked our markings several times and we know everything's properly aligned, so we can continue on to removing the crank bolt. Now we can install our side engine mount. I already have both of my upper mounting bolts inside of their ports. Those are ready to get aligned with the engine. When we go to get this installed, you can see the lower mounting bolt hole here, just underneath the water pump pulley. The other two mounting bolt holes are just above the water pump pulley. Just have to maneuver things around as necessary here. Be extremely careful for your timing belt. Once you have all the hardware started in by hand, go ahead and snug it up. The torque for this is 33 foot-pounds. The bolt that I'm on right now is going to be the hardest to get a torque wrench into. Just go ahead and make sure it's nice and tight. Okay, right there is bottomed out. Just gonna make sure this one's snug. Like I said, getting a torque wrench in here can be difficult. Let's continue on to the other two. Now it's time for our timing belt guide. For this, when we had removed it, I had mentioned to make sure that you reinstall it in the same orientation. We want to have it so it's flexed gently outward, not towards the timing belt in any way. We'll press this all the way in. It should rest pretty close to up against that timing belt, but definitely not touching it. Now it's time for the lower timing belt cover. We'll get this in position and start in the lower mounting hardware here. Get this center one here. We just got two more bolts here. Back up in the engine compartment, we have our rearward cam cover here. We'll get this in position. We have the area where the wiring harness goes onto, and also 5 mounting bolt ports. Once we have everything aligned, we can start in those mounting bolts by hand, snug them up, and then realign our wiring harness into its corresponding slot. When putting this in position, you want to try to align the bottom first. Once you hear it click into place, go ahead and roll the upper portion in as well. We'll start in each of those mounting bolts. For this one leading into the port, I just have it on my 10mm socket. That's going to help me reach it a little bit easier. Get this last one on the bottom corner. They're all started in, let's snug them up. Just double check, make sure that's properly secured, it's not off kilter in any way. Secure the wiring harness. Let's move along to the front cam cover. When installing the forward cover, we have those same areas for the 5 mounting bolts. When we go to put this in position, we're going to start with the bottom portion first. We'll roll it in along the top and start in each of those mounting bolts. Once they're all started in, you know what to do. Just go ahead and snug them right up. As far as this cover, you want to ensure you have your rubber plug remounted in this area. We've already confirmed that everything's aligned as it needs to be behind here. Now we can make our way back inside the wheel well. We're going to be paying attention just lower than the alternator. We want to reinstall our tensioner. For this, we have the center bolt that'll make its way right through this area. And then we have the lower mounting bolt port right here. We'll get everything aligned, start in both of the mounting bolts, snug them up, and then we can torque them. I've got my center bolt already going through the tensioner. That's going to make things just a little bit easier for me for this installation. The lower bolt is considerably smaller. Once you have those bottomed out, the torque for the larger center bolt is 33 foot-pounds. The smaller lower bolt is 16 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install our crank pulley. We'll slide this over the crankshaft, making sure that we align our keyway while pressing this inward towards the engine. Once you feel as though you have that pressed in, it's time for our crank pulley bolt. For this, when you go to install it, make sure the threading is clean and then coat it with a little bit of clean motor oil. When installing this bolt, you never want to use an impact tool to install it. You can cause damage. The torque for this is 47 foot-pounds, then an additional 60 degrees. When you go to torque this, you may find that the crank wants to spin on you. You want to make sure you have a crank holder tool. It looks like a socket like this, fits directly in here. Now we're going to have that leading all the way down up against our control arm, being extremely careful not to cause any damage to the oil filter. We'll go ahead and start trying to torque this here. This will just pivot a little bit. There's our 47 foot-pounds. Let's continue on to an additional 60 degrees as I mentioned. It's just a little less than a quarter turn. There we are, that's pretty good. To get our tool out of here, I'm only going to turn this rearward just as much as I need to get the tool out. Double check to make sure everything's seated properly down here. Let's pause on the wheel well. Before installing the splash shield and the wheel, we'll make our way to the upper mount here. We're going to start the through bolt through from the front towards the rear there. We'll start it in by hand. Before tightening that, we need to also install the upper mounting bolts. We'll snug those, fully torque those, and then we'll finish by snugging and torquing the through bolt. This bolt has its vibration dampener on it. The torque for the upper bolts is 33 foot-pounds. When you go to snug the through bolt, you want to make sure you have the vibration dampener facing over towards the engine. That's the rubber portion. Should want to fit right into its groove there. The torque for the through bolt is 40 foot-pounds. With that torqued, it's time to reattach the ground strap to that mounting bracket. Go ahead and start in your 10mm bolt and snug it up. Once you're sure that that's secured, let's make our way across this mounting bracket all the way over towards the engine. We have another 10mm bolt to install. Put this in underneath here. This is just underneath the power steering pump. Okay, right there is tight. Just make sure this shield is properly secured down. Moving just above that area, we can see our power steering pump. We have the shaft that protrudes out. You can see that it is splined. We're going to reinstall our pump pulley, which is also splined. Go ahead and align it, press it in up against the pump, and reinstall the mounting nut. If it doesn't feel like it aligns, just go ahead and carefully start pulling it away from the pump, turn it a little bit, and then try reapplying it. It should want to slide right in. Once you have the pulley nut snug, we're going to continue on to torquing this to 47 foot-pounds. When you go to torque it, the pump pulley and shaft will want to spin on you. You can go ahead and hold that still with a small prying device. It's time for the serpentine belt. We've already taken note of the routing, so we'll just reinstall this in the same orientation. Before we can put it over all the pulleys, we will have to release tension on that tensioner. Let's start with down at the bottom at the crank pulley. We're going to start from the top here, bring it all the way down. We'll wrap it around that crank pulley. If you need to, you can make your way into the wheel well for this. That's why we left the fender liner off. While holding light pressure on this, we're going to have to take the rearward portion of the belt, the area that goes up and over the crank pulley. We're going to take that and bring it over the idler pulley all the way up here. Continuing on, we'll wrap it around the power steering pump pulley. And now we're going to pause in this area. We're going to take hold of the front of the belt down along the bottom and start bringing it around the AC compressor. As we continue on, we're just double checking to make sure the belt did not fall off any of the ribs. If it's off by even one tooth on any of the pulleys, you can destroy the belt and cause other damage. After you're around the AC compressor, we're going to go around the tensioner pulley as well. Bring that right up here. And now all this should be held all the way over towards the alternator. While holding light pressure here, we're going to continue on by twisting that tensioner so we can apply the belt over the alternator and make sure it's situated over each one of the pulleys properly. Just be careful for any pinch points here. This is not a race. You need to make sure you're as safe as possible and everything's properly aligned. Feels as though I'm off on that power steering pump pulley on my application here, so I'm just going to make my adjustments as needed. Just make a thorough inspection all the way around each of the pulleys. This looks good. We'll reinstall our splash shield. Starting down along the bottom here, we're just going to tuck this up and above the bumper cover. Put in our 2 push clips in this area. Let's start reattaching up here now. Put that one in. Now we have our Phillips head down in this corner. Make sure your fender liner is properly secured. We'll reinstall our passenger side front wheel. One last inspection in this area. Let's get the wheel in place. After they're started on there, go ahead and snug them up. We'll get the wheel back on the ground and torque each of these to 94 foot-pounds. The wheel's back on the ground. We'll torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Let's make our way back up under the hood. Continuing on from here, we're going to take hold of the power steering reservoir and pull it out through this slot and then leave it down around this area. But before I do so, I want to show you the bracket for the coolant reservoir right down here. After you have the power steering reservoir pushed off to the side, we'll slide that coolant reservoir down into the proper positioning in this bracket. Get this top portion aligned with its mounting area. Put in the push clip. Down along the inboard side of that coolant reservoir, we need to make sure our power steering hose is properly secured. Let's take that coolant hose and bring it over here. We'll reinstall the cap. Just press this right into the washer fluid reservoir. Now it's time for the power steering reservoir. That's going to fit right down in its bracket here and latch in. Once you feel as though you have it pressed down, try to give it a little wiggle. You want to ensure this is properly secured so that way there, if you hit a bump, it doesn't come flying up and potentially spill. The next thing you want to do is make sure you check your engine oil. You can do that by using your dipstick here. Go ahead and pull it out, give it a quick wipe, reinsert it, and then pull it back out to check the level. If it looks like it's low, go ahead and top it off with the manufacturer's specified oil, 5W20. It's time to reinstall the engine cover. Looking along the top of the intake, you should have two rubber grommets, and if you were to look along the bottom of the engine cover, you're going to find two tabs that go into those. We'll align this, press it down, and then make our way to the two forward screws. As for the screws, typically for these, I like to try to turn them counterclockwise until they feel as though they stop, and then I'm going to turn them clockwise a quarter turn and make sure they're locked in. Repeat the process for each. Double check to make sure your engine cover is properly secured so it doesn't vibrate around on you, cause noise while you're driving down the road. Okay friend, we finished the installation of our camshaft position sensor. The next thing you need to do is attempt to start up the vehicle. Once it does start, turn it right back off after approximately 5 seconds and triple check your belt routing, ensuring you're sitting on each one of the pulleys properly. Close the hood and take your vehicle for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.